Hello. This lesson will be on an introduction to complex numbers. So what we need to remember about the imaginary number I is that I is equal to the square root of -1. Since a square root cannot be negative because any number times itself would be positive, we express the idea of the square root of a negative number as I, an imaginary number. So the whole premise of this activity comes from the idea that I is equal to the square root of -1. Come a step further with me and let's think about what would happen if we took both sides of this equation and we squared both sides. Well, let's see. I to the power of 2 would just be I squared. And whenever you multiply something by itself, it comes out of a square root, right? So this would look like the square root of -1 times itself times the square root of -1. And whenever you multiply two square roots that have the same thing in them, it would come outside. So that would just be -1. So we're using the idea that I squared is equal to -1 in order to solve problems like this. Let's go ahead and look at this specific example. So we have the square root of -16, which could be written a different way. It could be written as the square root of -1 times 16, right? So let's think about this. What is the square root of 16? Well, the square root of 16 is 4, right? So 4 can come out and we have a square root of -1 inside. Now, there's a -1 underneath the square root, and we just talked about the idea that that's actually equal to I. So that we could simplify square root of -1 as I. So our answer here is 4I. Go ahead and input that right here. You can click 4 and you can type the letter I, or you can click the letter I here. It doesn't matter which one you do, I don't believe. I'll try both and make sure. Great. Let's try another one. All right. So here we have the square root of -64, which is equal to the square root of -1 times 64. Let's see, the square root of 64, what times itself is 64? Well, that's 8. So an 8 comes out of the radical. And then this square root of -1 is really just I. So we could write this as 8I. 8I. And looks like you can type the letter I also. Okay, this one's very similar. This would be 3I because the square root of -9 is 3. Let's jump to the next level. All right, this one's a little bit trickier. Okay, so here we have the square root of -13, right? Now let's think about this for a second. 13 is a prime number. It doesn't have any factors. So the only thing that we can do is all we can multiply is -1 times 13. There's nothing else we can multiply. Now we know that -1, that's the equivalent of I. So an I comes out. And the square root of 13 is still left inside of the square root. So this would be I times the square root of 13. The negative was used by the I. All right, this one's pretty similar. Let's keep jumping forward. All right, this one's a little trickier. Let's go ahead and do this one. So here we have 6 minus the square root of -1. Well, what's another way that we can write the square root of -1? We can write it as I. So let's just call this 6 minus I. Since this is a complex number, since the 6 is a real number and the -I, that's an imaginary number, we can't combine these, right? So this is already simplified. Our answer is simply 6 minus I. All right, let's go ahead and write this as a complex number. Remember, a complex number is a number written in the form of A plus BI, where this is our real number and this is our imaginary number. So it's a combination of real and imaginary numbers. So when we have negative 16 plus the square root of negative 10, what we want to do is see what we can take out of this square root. Now the only thing that this breaks down to is 2 times 5, or negative 2 times negative 5. But since neither of those would be able to have a square root, that won't help us simplify that. So we don't need to reduce this. We just need to take out the I. So this would be equal to negative 16 plus I square root of 10, or I times the square root of 10. Negative 16 plus I times the square root of 10. All right, this one's pretty similar. Let's skip to the next level. Oops, I'm erasing. All right, this one's a little bit different. Let's do this together. So here we have negative the square root of negative 20. All right, so we could write this. Remember, we're trying to factor out something from the 20. We could write this as negative square root of negative 4 times 5. Remember, negative 4 is a perfect square because the square root of 4 is 2. So if we take this out, we can have negative square root of, well, let's rewrite this as negative 1 times 4, which is negative 4, times 5. Let's use a different color. This negative 1 square root, when it comes out, that's going to become an I. And then when this 4 comes out, that's going to become a 2. So we're going to have 2I comes out. And then left inside, what didn't come out is just the square root of 5, because the square root of 5 is not a whole number. So that is our answer. 2I times the square root of 5. Oh, I forgot about the negative sign. If you'll see, I answered 2I times the square root of 5, but there's a negative right here that we forgot about. So the answer probably is negative 2I times the square root of 5. If you'll see up here, we had this negative sign right here that I forgot to bring down at the end. So that's one thing you want to watch out for. It's a very common mistake. Don't worry, everyone makes them. But what's important is that we correct them and we understand why we make them. Okay, let's try this one. It's similar to the last one. Hopefully we can learn from our mistake this time. So we have negative the square root of negative 18, right? So we still have the negative outside. And how can we write negative 18 but break it down so that there is a perfect square inside? 6 times 3, those aren't perfect squares. Oh, 2 times 9. So think of it as negative 1 times 2 times 9. let's see, the square root of negative 1, that's the same as I, so we can bring out an I. Square root of 2, there is no square root of 2, but there is a square root of 9. The square root of 9 is 3. So this is equal to, and let's not make the same mistake as last time. Remember, the negative comes down, so negative 3i times the square root of 2 is the only thing that's left inside. We took out the negative 1, took out the 9. All that's left is a 2. Let's see if we get this right. That means that we learned from last time. Hopefully we've got it down. Cross your fingers. Nice. All right, so this one's pretty similar to the one that we did just now. So I'm going to skip to the next level and see if there's any that get a little bit more difficult. This is, again, similar, just a single number right here with a negative sign underneath it. All right, this one looks a little more complex. Let's go ahead and look at this one together. So here we have negative 11 minus the square root of negative 81, right? Now the square root of 81 is 9, but since there's a negative under here, you're also taking out the negative 1, right? So that's going to become an I, as we know. So this will be equal to negative 11 minus, let's see, what would come out from here? We would get an I, right? That would be an I. And then if we took this out, that would be a 9. It would be a positive 9. So let's think about what this really is, right? We're taking out a positive 9 and we're taking out an I. So what this really is, sorry, I don't want to confuse you. We're taking out a 9 and we're taking out an I. It's not I plus 9. We're taking out a positive 9. So what we would get is negative 11 minus 9i, right? The square root of negative 81, this is equal to negative 9i. So when we have negative 11 minus that, we just write it like this as a complex number. So negative 11 minus 9i. All right, this is very similar. If you can get this one by just looking at the answer, then you should be ready. This is negative 6. And then we know the square root of 25 is 5. So the square root of negative 25 would be 5i. Remember, because when it's the negative square root, that's how you have to do it. So see if you can explain that to someone, and then you know that you're ready, and you'll be at the level for an A, which is a 90, remember.